We don't serve that kind of food to those people in first class, sweetie. Those words cut through the pristine air of the first-class cabin like a knife through silk. The flight attendant's voice dripped with barely concealed disgust as she looked down at an 8-year-old girl whose only crime was being born with beautiful dark skin and asking for the same meal as everyone else. 50 passengers turned their heads, some in shock, others in uncomfortable silence. But none of them knew who they were really looking at. None of them realized that the quiet man sitting next to that little girl wasn't just any passenger. He wasn't just any father protecting his daughter. Within 2 hours, that flight attendant would lose her job. Within a week, she'd become the face of a global scandal that would rock the airline industry to its core. And within a month, her name would be synonymous with everything wrong with corporate America. Because you see, the man she was messing with, the man she thought she could humiliate and intimidate, he wasn't just another black father trying to give his daughter a nice trip. He was the CEO who was about to buy her entire airline. This isn't just a story about karma. This isn't just about a racist getting what she deserved. This is about how hate met its match at 35,000 feet and how one father's love for his daughter changed an entire industry forever. To understand what happened on that plane, you need to know about Marcus Washington. And to know Marcus, you need to understand that everything he did, every decision he made, every breath he took, was for one person, his 8-year-old daughter Zoe. Marcus grew up in Detroit's inner city, where hope was as scarce as opportunity. His mother, Sarah, worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, cleaning offices at night, stocking shelves in the early morning, and watching other people's children during the day. She never had time to read him bedtime stories, but she made sure to whisper one thing in his ear every night. Baby, your mind is your way out. Study like your life depends on it, because it does. And study. He did. While other kids played video games, Marcus devoured books. While they hung out on street corners, he was in the library until closing time. His mother's sacrifice wasn't going to be for nothing. Harvard Business School didn't just accept Marcus Washington. They recruited him. Full scholarship, top of his class internships at companies most people only dream of working for. But success came with a price. The higher he climbed, the more isolated he felt. Every boardroom he entered, every meeting he attended, every handshake and deal he made reminded him that he was different. He was the exception, not the rule. But none of that mattered when he met Angela. She was a pediatric oncologist with hands that could heal and a laugh that could cure any bad day. She saw past the suits and the success to the boy from Detroit, who still carried his mother's words in his heart. They married 3 years later, and when Zoe was born, Marcus thought his world was complete. Angela was everything Marcus wasn't. Patient, where he was driven; gentle, where he was fierce; optimistic, where he was cautious. She balanced him, grounded him, reminded him that success meant nothing if you didn't have love to share it with. Then cancer took her away. 2 years ago on a Tuesday, that started like any other, Angela collapsed in their kitchen. Stage 4, ovarian cancer, the doctor said. 6 months to live if they were lucky. They weren't. The last thing Angela said to Marcus wasn't about herself. It wasn't about the pain or the fear or the unfairness of leaving her baby girl behind. Her final words were about their daughter. Promise me you'll show her the world. Promise me you'll teach her that she belongs anywhere she wants to be. Promise me you'll never let anyone make her feel small. Marcus had built an empire. Apex Global Enterprises, a multi-billion-dollar conglomerate that specialized in acquiring struggling companies and turning them around. He could buy and sell corporations like other people bought groceries. But all that power, all that wealth couldn't save the one person who mattered most. Now it was just him and Zoe. 8 years old, brilliant beyond her years, with her mother's laugh and her father's stubborn determination. She wanted to be an astronaut to travel to Mars to discover new worlds. Every night she'd ask Marcus to tell her stories about space, about brave explorers who weren't afraid of the unknown. "Daddy," she'd say, curled up in his lap, "do you think Mommy can see us from heaven? Do you think she's proud of us?" Every day, baby girl, Marcus would whisper, fighting back tears. Every single day. This trip to London was supposed to be special. Marcus had business there, a potential acquisition that would expand Apex's reach into the aviation industry. SkyLine Airways was struggling, hemorrhaging money and reputation in equal measure. Marcus had been studying them for months, analyzing their books, their culture, their potential for transformation. But the business was just an excuse. The real reason for this trip was a promise made 2 years ago on a hospital bed. Angela had always wanted to take Zoe to London, to show her the Greenwich Observatory, where scientists map the stars their daughter dreamed of reaching. When she's older, Angela had said, when she can really appreciate it, we'll take her to see where it all began, where people first dared to look up and wonder what was out there. Marcus had booked first-class seats on SkyLine Airways, partly for comfort, partly for the business intelligence, but mostly because he wanted Zoe's first international flight to be magical. He wanted her to feel like a princess, to understand that she deserved the very best life had to offer. What he didn't expect was to encounter someone who thought otherwise. JFK Airport's Terminal 4 buzzed with the controlled chaos of international travel. Marcus held Zoe's hand as they walked through the first-class check-in, past the envious glances of economy passengers and the practiced smiles of airline employees who were paid to recognize wealth. "Daddy, this place is huge." Zoe whispered, her eyes wide, as she took in the soaring ceilings and gleaming marble floors. She wore her favorite dress, the purple one with stars that reminded her of galaxies, and carried a small backpack shaped like a rocket ship. "Wait until you see the plane, baby girl." Marcus smiled, remembering Angela's excitement about travel. She'd been the adventurous one, always planning their next trip, their next exploration. SkyLine Airways Flight 447 was a Boeing 777, one of the airline's flagship aircraft. The first-class cabin was a study in manufactured luxury, 12 private suites arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each with a lie-flat bed, personal entertainment system, and enough space to work or relax in comfort. Marcus and Zoe were assigned seats 1A and 1B, right at the front of the cabin. As they settled in, Zoe immediately began exploring every button, every compartment, every feature of their surroundings. "Look, Daddy, the seat turns into a bed, and there's a TV that comes out of here. And look at this little closet." Her enthusiasm was infectious, drawing smiles from nearby passengers and crew members. The cabin filled slowly with the kind of travelers who could afford 4-figure tickets, business executives heading to London meetings, wealthy retirees on luxury tours, celebrities trying to avoid recognition in coach. The atmosphere was hushed, refined, the kind of place where conversations happened in whispers, and every detail was designed to convey exclusivity. Marcus had flown first class countless times, but seeing it through Zoe's eyes made it magical again. She marveled at the real silverware, the cloth napkins, the way the flight attendants glided through the aisles with practiced grace. "Daddy, do you think the pilots live up there?" she asked, pointing toward the cockpit. "Just during the flight, sweetheart. They have families at home just like us. Do you think they miss their families when they're flying?" The question hit Marcus harder than expected. Every business trip, every long day at the office, every moment away from Zoe felt like time stolen from what really mattered. "I'm sure they do, baby. That's why it's important to make every moment count when we're together." As the boarding process continued, Marcus noticed the crew. The captain, a distinguished Hispanic man in his 50s, briefly emerged from the cockpit to greet VIP passengers. The flight attendants moved with efficiency, and professionalism, offering pre-departure beverages and ensuring everyone was settled. Everything seemed perfect. The service was attentive, the atmosphere peaceful, the promise of their London adventure just hours away. Marcus allowed himself to relax for the first time in weeks. This was exactly what Zoe needed, what they both needed. He pulled out his phone to take a picture of Zoe examining the safety card with scientific curiosity. For the scrapbook, he said, thinking of Angela's carefully maintained photo albums that documented every moment of their family life. "Will you tell me about London again?" Zoe asked, settling into her seat as the final passengers boarded. "Well," Marcus began, his voice taking on the storytelling tone that always captured his daughter's attention. "London is a city where scientists and explorers have been reaching for the stars for hundreds of years. And tomorrow, we're going to see where some of the greatest discoveries in astronomy were made." What Marcus didn't know was that their journey to those stars was about to be derailed by someone who thought they didn't belong in the sky at all. Rachel Mitchell had been having the worst month of her life, and it was about to get infinitely worse. At 45, she stood in the first-class galley of Flight 447, adjusting her perfectly styled blonde hair and checking her reflection in the polished surface of the coffee machine. 20 years with SkyLine Airways, 3 commendations for excellence, and 1 Employee of the Year award. But none of that mattered anymore. Her husband had filed for divorce 6 weeks ago. Her lawyer said she'd be lucky to keep the house. Her teenage daughter blamed her for the family falling apart and hadn't spoken to her in 2 weeks. The only constant in her increasingly chaotic life was her job, this cabin, this sense of authority and control that came with the gold wings pinned to her navy blazer. Rachel had always prided herself on running the tightest first-class cabin in the fleet. Every passenger properly served, every detail perfectly executed, every interaction a reflection of the premium experience SkyLine promised its most valuable customers. But underneath the professional facade, something darker had been festering for years. It started with small things. Questioning whether certain passengers belonged in first class, making assumptions about how they'd behaved or what they could afford. She told herself it was about maintaining standards, about protecting the exclusive atmosphere that first-class passengers expected. The truth was uglier than that. Rachel had grown up in suburban Connecticut, in a world where diversity meant having one black family in the neighborhood and inclusion meant inviting them to the annual block party. Her parents had taught her to be polite, never to say anything obviously racist, but the subtle messages had sunk in deep. Some people belonged in certain places, and others didn't. Now, as she surveyed her domain one final time before departure, her gaze fell on seats 1A and 1B. A black man in an expensive suit sat next to a young girl who was clearly his daughter. Rachel's first thought wasn't about their comfort or their needs. It was about whether they belonged there. The man was well-dressed, she had to admit. His watch looked expensive. His shoes were polished. His carry-on bag was high-end leather. But Rachel had developed what she considered a keen eye for spotting passengers who were flying above their station. People using miles upgrades, corporate bookings, or other ways to access a cabin they couldn't normally afford. Something about this particular passenger set off every alarm bell in her prejudiced mind. Maybe it was the way he held himself, confident and entitled. Maybe it was how the little girl had immediately started exploring every feature of their seats. Maybe it was simply that Rachel's world was collapsing around her, and she needed someone to blame for her misery. Whatever the reason, Rachel Mitchell made a decision that would destroy her life. She decided that Marcus and Zoe Washington didn't belong in her first-class cabin. "Good evening," she said, approaching their row with her practiced customer service smile. But unlike the warm, genuine greeting she'd given the white businessman in 2A or the elderly white couple in 3B, her tone was subtly different. Cooler, more formal, with an underlying edge that suggested she was doing them a favor by acknowledging them at all. Marcus looked up from helping Zoe with her seatbelt. Good evening. Beautiful aircraft. Rachel's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Are you sure you're in the right seats? She asked, her voice carrying just enough doubt to be insulting without being overtly confrontational. Marcus's expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes. He'd heard that question before in boardrooms and country clubs and exclusive restaurants. He knew the game, knew the subtle ways people tried to make him feel like an intruder in spaces where his money was welcome, but his presence wasn't. Seats 1A and 1B, he replied evenly, pulling out his boarding passes. Is there a problem? Rachel glanced at the passes, seeing clearly that they were legitimate first-class tickets. Her face flushed slightly, but instead of apologizing, she doubled down. Of course not. I just want to make sure you're comfortable. Sometimes our computer systems, well, you know how technology can be. She let the implication hang in the air, that somehow their seats might be a mistake, an error that would soon be corrected. Zoe looked up at her father, sensing the tension, but not understanding its source. Daddy, why is the lady asking about our seats? Marcus squeezed his daughter's hand gently. Everything's fine, sweetheart. The nice lady was just checking on us. But Rachel Mitchell was far from finished. In her mind, she wasn't being racist. She was being thorough, professional, protective of the standards that made first class special. She couldn't see the poison in her own thoughts, couldn't recognize the bias that had been planted years ago and had now grown into something toxic and destructive. She was about to learn that some people fight back. The first hour of the flight passed peacefully enough. As Flight 447 climbed through the clouds above New York, Zoe pressed her face to the window, watching the city lights fade into darkness below. Look, Daddy, we're flying through the stars. Marcus smiled, remembering how Angela used to encourage Zoe's fascination with space. Not quite through them, baby girl, but we're definitely getting closer. The peace was shattered when Rachel Mitchell returned for the meal service. She approached the other first-class passengers with genuine warmth, explaining menu options in detail, offering wine pairings, laughing at their small jokes. Marcus watched her transformation, noting how her entire demeanor changed when she interacted with the white passengers versus the cool professionalism she reserved for his family. When she reached their row, the mask slipped back into place. Dinner service, she announced, flatly, holding 2 menus without offering them. Zoe, oblivious to the undercurrents, immediately perked up. Oh, do you have astronaut food? You know the freeze-dried ice cream they eat in space? Rachel's expression soured, as if Zoe had asked for something ridiculous. We don't carry that kind of specialty items, she said, her pause loaded with meaning. Maybe some chicken nuggets would be more appropriate for someone your age. Marcus felt the familiar burn of anger in his chest, but kept his voice level. She'll have the lobster thermidor, please, and I'll take the filet mignon. Rachel's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. Are you sure she can handle that? It's quite sophisticated. The sauce can be quite messy. The implication was clear. This child couldn't be trusted with fine dining, couldn't be expected to have the refinement necessary for such cuisine. Zoe, who had been eating at high-end restaurants since she could hold a fork, looked confused. I eat sophisticated food all the time, ma'am. My daddy takes me to fancy restaurants. I'm sure he does, Rachel replied with a condescending smile that didn't reach her eyes. Several passengers in nearby rows had begun to notice the interaction. The elderly white couple in 3B exchanged uncomfortable glances. The businessman in 2A looked up from his laptop with a frown. Marcus made a mental note of the witnesses, his business instincts automatically cataloging evidence. The lobster will be fine. Thank you. Rachel's forced smile grew even more strained, but she marked their order and moved on. 20 minutes later, when she returned with the meals, the hostility became even more obvious. She served the other passengers with flourish and attention, explaining each dish, ensuring their satisfaction. When she reached Marcus and Zoe, she simply placed the plates down without ceremony. But it was what happened next that crossed the line from poor service into deliberate harassment. As Zoe excused herself to use the lavatory, Rachel quickly intercepted her path. "Oh, sweetie, the first-class bathroom is being serviced right now," she said loudly enough for other passengers to hear. "There's one in coach that might be more suitable for you." Zoe looked confused. "But I saw someone come out of it just a minute ago." "That was before the cleaning crew went in," Rachel lied smoothly. "Trust me, you don't want to use it right now." Marcus stood up immediately. "She'll wait for this one. Thank you." "Sir, I'm just trying to—" Her excuse was cut short, as another passenger emerged from the very bathroom she claimed was being serviced. The white businessman from 2A dried his hands and returned to his seat completely unaware that he'd just exposed Rachel's lie. The silence that followed was deafening. Several passengers had witnessed the exchange, and the truth was undeniable. Rachel had tried to send an 8-year-old girl to coach class simply to use the bathroom. Zoe looked up at her father with wide, confused eyes. "Daddy, why was she lying?" Marcus knelt down to his daughter's level, his voice gentle, but his eyes burning with controlled fury. "Some people have problems in their hearts, baby. It's not about you. It's about them." As Zoe used the bathroom, Marcus remained standing, his imposing 6'2" frame, creating a barrier between Rachel and his daughter. When she emerged, he guided her back to their seats with protective deliberation. "Sir." Rachel began, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "I don't appreciate your tone, and I don't appreciate your treatment of my daughter." Marcus interrupted, his voice quiet, but carrying the weight of absolute authority. "From this point forward, I'd prefer that you stay away from our row. If we need anything, we'll ask one of your colleagues." The dismissal was clear, professional, and devastating. Rachel's face flushed red as she realized that several passengers and crew members had witnessed her public humiliation. But instead of backing down, instead of recognizing her mistake and apologizing, Rachel Mitchell made the decision that would end her career and change her life forever. She decided to escalate. For the next hour, Rachel watched Marcus and Zoe with growing resentment. She saw the way other passengers smiled at Zoe's enthusiasm, the way the younger flight attendants naturally gravitated toward their row to chat with the charming little girl about her dreams of space travel. Maria Santos, a sweet 26-year-old flight attendant from Los Angeles, had taken over service for row 1. She brought Zoe extra dessert and even found some space-themed playing cards from the children's activity kit. "Have you ever seen the International Space Station?" Maria asked, crouching beside Zoe's seat. "Not yet, but Daddy promised we'll look for it from London. Did you know astronauts can see the whole Earth from up there? That's so cool. You know, my cousin is studying to be an astronaut too." Marcus watched the interaction with gratitude, noting the stark contrast between Maria's natural warmth and Rachel's manufactured hostility. This was how customer service was supposed to work, with genuine human connection and respect. But from the galley, Rachel Mitchell watched with growing fury. In her twisted perspective, she wasn't seeing excellent customer service from her colleague. She was seeing her authority being undermined, her judgment being questioned, her version of first-class standards being ignored. And then she made the call that would destroy everything. Using the aircraft's satellite phone system, a resource reserved for genuine emergencies, Rachel contacted the ground crew at London Heathrow. She reported what she called an increasingly volatile passenger situation and requested that airport police meet the aircraft upon arrival. Her description of Marcus was a masterpiece of racist stereotyping, disguised as professional concern. Large black male, approximately 6'2", becoming increasingly aggressive and intimidating toward crew. Accompanied by a child who may be at risk, passenger has made threats against staff and appears to be under the influence of alcohol. Every word was a lie. Every detail was designed to trigger maximum response from law enforcement, and every consequence that followed would be entirely her fault. As Flight 447 continued its journey across the Atlantic, Rachel Mitchell had no idea that she had just declared war on the wrong man. From Seat 2C, Eleanor Thompson had seen enough injustice in her 70 years to recognize it instantly when it unfolded in front of her. The retired federal judge adjusted her reading glasses and closed her book, a biography of Thurgood Marshall that suddenly felt relevant in ways she hadn't expected when she'd packed it for this trip to her granddaughter's wedding in London. Eleanor had spent 4 decades fighting discrimination from the bench, watching lawyers attempt to use coded language and subtle bias to undermine justice. She'd developed an expert eye for recognizing prejudice in all its forms, from the blatant hatred of the past to the sophisticated microaggressions of the present. What she was witnessing now fell squarely into the latter category. The flight attendant's behavior toward the black father and his daughter was textbook discrimination, not obvious enough to be immediately called out, but consistent enough to create a pattern that any experienced observer could identify. Eleanor had noticed it from the beginning. The way Rachel's tone changed when she spoke to them, the unnecessary questions about their seats, the assumption about the child's meal preferences. The bathroom incident had been particularly egregious, a clear attempt to humiliate and exclude. But what troubled Eleanor most was the silence from other passengers. She understood it, but she didn't accept it. People were uncomfortable witnessing discrimination, but that discomfort often translated into inaction rather than intervention. Not today. Eleanor had her phone out, discreetly recording the interactions. In her decades on the bench, she'd learned that documentation was everything. Without evidence, injustice became a matter of he said, she said. With evidence, truth had a fighting chance. She watched the father, Marcus, she'd heard the little girl call him, handle each incident with remarkable restraint. His composure impressed her. Many people would have lost their temper by now, would have given Rachel exactly the aggressive black man narrative she seemed to be trying to provoke. But Marcus was playing chess, while Rachel played checkers. He was documenting, controlling his responses, protecting his daughter, while maintaining his dignity. It reminded Eleanor of the civil rights lawyers she'd worked with in the early days of her career, people who understood that the real battle was often about who kept their composure under pressure. The little girl, Zoe, was handling it even better than many adults Eleanor had seen in similar situations. Her innocence was protective, allowing her to respond to each incident with genuine confusion, rather than hurt. But Eleanor could see the moments when understanding flickered across her young face when she began to realize that the flight attendant's behavior wasn't normal. When the young flight attendant Maria took over their service, Eleanor smiled. Here was someone who understood that professionalism meant treating every passenger with equal respect and warmth. The contrast between Maria's natural service and Rachel's hostility was stark and damning. Eleanor made her decision. She opened her purse and pulled out one of her business cards. Simple white cardstock with her name and the words, "Federal Judge, Retired," in elegant script. When this flight landed, she was going to make sure Marcus and Zoe had a credible witness to everything that had happened. Justice, she'd learned over the years, often depended on good people choosing to get involved rather than looking the other way. Today was one of those days. 2 hours into the flight, as most passengers settled into sleep or entertainment, Rachel Mitchell's campaign of harassment shifted into a higher gear. Her first move was subtle, but calculated. She approached Captain Rodriguez during his routine cabin walk, her face carefully arranged in an expression of professional concern. "Captain, I need to discuss a passenger situation with you," she said quietly, glancing meaningfully toward row 1. Captain Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran with an impeccable safety record, followed her gaze. He saw a well-dressed black man reading a business magazine while his young daughter colored in a sketchbook. Nothing seemed amiss. "What's the issue, Rachel?" "The passenger in 1A has been increasingly difficult since takeoff. He's questioned my service multiple times, been verbally aggressive, and I'm concerned about escalation." Each word was carefully chosen, designed to plant seeds of concern without making obvious false accusations. "Has he threatened anyone?" Rachel hesitated just long enough to suggest reluctance before answering. "Not explicitly, but his tone has been very intimidating. And he's quite large. I'm worried about what might happen if he continues to escalate." The racial undertones were subtle, but unmistakable. She was activating every stereotype about angry black men, dangerous black men, unpredictable black men. Captain Rodriguez focused on safety above all else, made a mental note to keep an eye on the situation. What Rachel didn't tell him was that she'd already begun documenting her fabricated version of events, creating a paper trail that would support whatever action she planned to take. An hour later, Rachel made her next move. She approached Marcus and Zoe during the second meal service, her demeanor shifting to fake medical concern. "Excuse me," she said loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "but your daughter looks a bit pale. Are you sure she's feeling well?" Zoe looked up from her drawing, confused. "I feel fine. Thank you. Sometimes children don't realize when they're not feeling well." Rachel continued her voice, taking on an authoritative tone. "She might be having a reaction to something she ate. Did you bring any outside food on board?" Marcus's patience was wearing thin. "My daughter is perfectly fine. And no, we didn't bring any food. I'm just concerned about food poisoning," Rachel pressed. "Sometimes people aren't used to the quality of cuisine we serve in first class. If she becomes ill, we might need to make an emergency landing." The implication was clear and insulting, that somehow Marcus and Zoe weren't accustomed to fine dining and might have digestive issues with proper food. "My daughter's health is my concern," Marcus replied, his voice controlled but firm. "She's fine, and I'd appreciate if you'd stop suggesting otherwise." Several passengers were now openly staring. Eleanor Thompson in 2C was taking careful notes. The businessman in 2A had put down his laptop, entirely clearly disturbed by what he was witnessing. But Rachel wasn't finished. Her next attack was even more brazen. 30 minutes later, she returned with what she claimed was an urgent discovery. "Sir, I'm afraid there's been a mistake with your seat assignments," she announced loudly enough for half the cabin to hear. "It appears these seats were double booked. I'm going to need you and your daughter to relocate to coach immediately." Marcus looked up calmly. "I have our confirmed first-class tickets right here," he said, producing the boarding passes. "There's no mistake." "I understand. This is frustrating," Rachel continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "But computer errors do happen. I can offer you a full refund for the difference in fare." "There is no computer error," Marcus stated firmly. "We purchased these seats 3 weeks ago. They're confirmed. We're not moving." Rachel's face flushed with false indignation. "Sir, I'm trying to resolve this situation diplomatically, but if you're going to be difficult—" "What seems to be the problem here?" interrupted James Chen, the head flight attendant, who had been summoned by the commotion. "Double-booked seats," Rachel explained quickly. "The system shows these passengers were supposed to be in 34F and 34G. James checked his tablet, scrolling through the passenger manifest. His frown deepened as he reviewed the data. "Rachel, there's no double booking. These passengers are confirmed in 1A and 1B. Their tickets were purchased weeks ago, and their seats have been assigned since check-in." The silence that followed was deafening. Rachel had been caught in an obvious lie in front of passengers, in front of her supervisor, in front of the man she was trying to displace. The system must have updated, she stammered. The system doesn't work that way, James replied coolly. Then turning to Marcus. I sincerely apologize for this confusion, sir. Is there anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable? Marcus's response was measured professional and devastating. An explanation of why your employee keeps fabricating reasons to move us from our paid seats would be a good start. James nodded grimly. I'll be speaking with the purser about this immediately. Again, my apologies. As James led Rachel toward the galley for what was clearly going to be a disciplinary conversation, Marcus felt a small measure of satisfaction, but he also felt a growing sense of unease. This wasn't random poor service. This was targeted harassment, and it was escalating. Zoe tugged at his sleeve. Daddy, why does that lady keep bothering us? Marcus considered his words carefully. Some people have problems that have nothing to do with us, sweetheart. We just need to stay calm and let the truth speak for itself. But even as he comforted his daughter, Marcus was calculating. In business, when someone launched this kind of sustained attack, it usually meant they were building towards something bigger. Rachel Mitchell wasn't just harassing them for sport. She was creating a narrative, building a case for something. The question was, what was her end game? He didn't have to wait long to find out. 20 minutes later, Rachel made her fourth and most desperate play. She approached their row with what she claimed was a medical emergency. I need you to move your daughter immediately, she announced. A passenger in 3B is having a severe allergic reaction to hair products, and we believe it might be from your daughter's hair care routine. It was her most audacious lie yet, and also her most racist. The implication that Zoe's natural hair or hair products were somehow dangerous was so obviously prejudiced that even passengers who had been trying to ignore the earlier incidents couldn't dismiss this one. Marcus stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow over Rachel. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, and absolutely deadly. My wife was an allergist, he said. Dr. Angela Washington, Johns Hopkins Medical Center. Before she died, she spent 15 years treating severe allergic reactions. So let me be very clear about something. There is no passenger in 3B having an allergic reaction to my daughter's hair products. There is no medical emergency. There is no justification for what you just said. The cabin fell silent. Even the engine noise seemed muted as Marcus continued. What there is, however, is a pattern of harassment that I've been documenting since takeoff. What there is an employee who has lied repeatedly, fabricated emergencies, and consistently targeted my family based on our race. Rachel's face went white. I never said anything about race. You didn't have to, Marcus interrupted. Your actions speak loud enough. Eleanor Thompson chose that moment to stand up from her seat in 2C. Excuse me, she said in a voice that carried the authority of 4 decades on the federal bench. But I've been watching this entire situation unfold, and I want everyone to know that this gentleman and his daughter have done absolutely nothing wrong. Every incident has been initiated by the flight attendant, and every claim she's made has been demonstrably false. Other passengers began to murmur agreement. The businessman in 2A nodded vigorously. Even the elderly couple in 3B, who allegedly had the allergic reaction, looked confused and concerned. Rachel realized she was losing control of the narrative. Her lies were being exposed, her authority was being undermined, and passengers were taking sides against her. So she made the call that would end everything. Retreating to the galley, Rachel picked up the satellite phone reserved for genuine emergencies. Her hands shaking with rage and desperation, she placed the call that would bring airport police to meet Flight 447 upon landing. Her description of Marcus was a masterwork of racist fiction. 6'2" black male, approximately 200 pounds, traveling with a minor child, becoming increasingly aggressive and threatening toward crew members. Multiple incidents of verbal intimidation, refusal to follow crew instructions, possible intoxication, request immediate police response upon arrival for passenger safety. Every word was calculated to trigger maximum law enforcement response. Every detail was designed to paint Marcus as a dangerous threat rather than a harassed passenger. As she hung up the phone, Rachel felt a moment of satisfaction. She'd shown him who was really in control. She demonstrated that actions had consequences. What she didn't realize was that she was absolutely right. Actions did have consequences. She just had no idea what those consequences were about to be. As Flight 447 crossed the halfway point over the Atlantic, Marcus Washington made a series of phone calls that would change everything. Zoe had finally fallen asleep, curled up in her lie-flat seat, with her rocket ship pillow and a blanket decorated with constellations. The cabin lights had been dimmed for the overnight portion of the flight, creating an intimate atmosphere that made conversations feel more private. Marcus pulled out his phone and activated the aircraft's Wi-Fi service. His first call was to his assistant Sarah Chen back in New York. "Sarah, it's Marcus. Yes, I know it's late. How are the preparations for tomorrow's meeting?" From her apartment in Manhattan, Sarah's voice came through clearly. "Everything's set for the SkyLine acquisition. The London team has the due diligence reports ready, and the board is standing by for your final recommendation." "Good. And what's our current assessment of their corporate culture?" "Mixed, honestly. Their financial performance has been poor, but that's mainly due to management issues. The bigger concern is their customer service record. We've found a pattern of discrimination complaints that haven't been properly addressed." Marcus glanced toward the galley, where Rachel was huddled with two other flight attendants, their conversation intense and secretive. "That's very relevant to my current situation. Is everything okay? Let's just say I'm getting a first-hand look at exactly the kind of cultural problems we'd need to fix post-acquisition." Zoe stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about rocket ships and stars. Marcus gently adjusted her blanket, his heart swelling with the fierce protectiveness that had driven every decision he'd made since Angela's death. His second call was to his legal team. "David, it's Marcus Washington. I need you to research something for me. What are the legal implications when an airline employee files a false police report about a passenger David Martinez, senior partner at Washington's law firm, was immediately alert?" "Marcus, what's happening? Are you in some kind of trouble?" "Potentially. I believe a flight attendant on this aircraft has made false statements to law enforcement about me and my daughter. I need to know what our options are. That could be anything from filing a false report to defamation to civil rights violations, depending on the specifics. Are you documenting everything I am? And I have witnesses." "Good. If this is what I think it is, we'll want to move quickly once you're on the ground. Do you need me to contact anyone?" Marcus considered the question. "Not yet. But have the litigation team on standby. This might get complicated." His third call was the most important one. "Robert, it's Marcus. Sorry to wake you." Robert Chen, CEO of SkyLine Airways, had been expecting this call, though not under these circumstances. The acquisition talks had been going on for months, and he knew Marcus was flying to London on one of their aircraft. "Marcus, how's the flight? I hope you're enjoying the first-class service. I specifically told the crew to take extra care of you." There was a pause that made Robert's stomach sink. "Actually, Robert, that's why I'm calling. I'm currently experiencing what I can only describe as systematic harassment from one of your senior flight attendants." "What? That's impossible. Let me get on the phone with the captain immediately." "It's being handled," Marcus interrupted. "But I wanted you to know that this acquisition just became much more complicated. The cultural issues we discussed during due diligence aren't theoretical problems. They're active, ongoing problems that are affecting passengers right now." Robert Chen felt his world shifting. The acquisition by Apex Global Enterprises was supposed to save SkyLine Airways from bankruptcy. Marcus Washington wasn't just any potential buyer. He was their only buyer, their lifeline, their last hope. Marcus, I am so sorry. Whatever happened, I will personally ensure it's addressed immediately. Please don't let one employee's actions reflect on our entire company. The employee isn't my concern, Robert. The system that enabled and protected her is my concern. We'll discuss it tomorrow. After ending the call, Marcus sat quietly in the dimmed cabin, processing the situation. He'd built his career and his fortune by acquiring struggling companies and transforming them. He understood corporate culture, understood how toxic behaviors could metastasize when left unchecked. What was happening to him and Zoe wasn't random. It was systemic. Rachel Mitchell hadn't invented her prejudices on this flight. She'd learned them, practiced them, refined them over years of employment with an airline that had clearly failed to address discrimination in its ranks. But Marcus also understood something else. He was in a unique position to do something about it. Tomorrow's acquisition meeting wasn't just about buying an airline anymore. It was about fundamentally changing how that airline operated, how it trained its employees, how it treated its customers. Rachel Mitchell thought she was exercising power over a passenger she didn't think belonged in first class. What she didn't realize was that she was about to provide the perfect case study for why SkyLine Airways needed new ownership, new leadership, and a complete cultural transformation. Marcus looked at his sleeping daughter, thinking about Angela's words. Promise me you'll teach her that she belongs anywhere she wants to be. Tomorrow, he was going to keep that promise in a way that would benefit not just Zoe, but every passenger who might face discrimination in the future. But first, they had to get through whatever Rachel Mitchell had planned for their arrival in London. The descent into London Heathrow began with Captain Rodriguez's voice crackling over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into London Heathrow Airport. Local time is 6:47 a.m., and it's a beautiful morning in London with clear skies and excellent visibility. Marcus gently woke Zoe, who stretched and rubbed her eyes. Are we there, Daddy? Almost, baby girl. Look out the window. There's London. Zoe pressed her face to the glass, gasping at the sight of the sprawling city below. The Thames snaked through the urban landscape like a silver ribbon, and in the distance the iconic landmarks she'd studied in books came into view. I can see Big Ben, and look, is that the London Eye? It sure is. And tomorrow we're going to see it all up close. Marcus felt a familiar pang of loss, remembering how Angela had planned this exact moment, how she'd imagined their daughter's first glimpse of London. But the sadness was mixed with gratitude. They'd made it despite everything. As the plane descended through the morning clouds, Marcus noticed something odd. Instead of approaching the main terminal, Flight 447 was being directed toward a remote gate on the far side of the airport. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez again. Due to gate availability issues, we'll be parking at a remote stand this morning. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened until we come to a complete stop and the seatbelt sign is turned off. Something cold settled in Marcus's stomach. In all his years of international business travel, he'd never seen a wide-body aircraft diverted to a remote stand unless there was a security issue. Through the window, he could see police vehicles racing across the tarmac, their blue lights flashing in the gray London dawn. Daddy, why are there police cars? Zoe asked, her voice small with worry. Marcus wrapped his arm around his daughter, trying to shield her from what he increasingly suspected was coming. Sometimes they meet planes for routine checks, sweetheart. Nothing to worry about. But his reassuring words couldn't calm his own racing heart. Rachel Mitchell had been unusually absent for the past hour, and now the plane was being met by law enforcement. The pieces were falling into place, in a pattern he desperately hoped he was wrong about. The aircraft came to a stop, but the engines continued running. Captain Rodriguez's voice returned, but this time the cheerful pilot persona was gone, replaced by stern official authority. Ladies and gentlemen, for your safety and security, please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Do not stand up or retrieve items from the overhead bins. Law enforcement personnel will be boarding the aircraft momentarily to address a security matter. A collective murmur of concern rippled through the cabin. Passengers exchanged worried glances, pulling out phones to call family members, speculating about what kind of security threat might have prompted such measures. Marcus felt Zoe's small hand slip into his. "Daddy, I'm scared. I know, baby. But remember what Mommy always said. We're stronger than whatever scary things happen to us." Through the aircraft windows, Marcus could see a small convoy of police vehicles surrounding the plane. Metropolitan police officers were taking positions, their presence both overwhelming and ominous. The main cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and heavy footsteps echoed through the aircraft. Two uniformed officers from London's Metropolitan Police entered the first-class cabin, their faces professional but tense. Behind them, Marcus could see Rachel Mitchell pointing in their direction, her face animated with what looked like vindicated righteousness. "That's him," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent cabin. "Row 1. The man who's been threatening me and intimidating the crew. He's been drinking and became increasingly aggressive throughout the flight." Every passenger in first class turned to stare at Marcus and Zoe, 60 pairs of eyes fixed on them with a mixture of curiosity, fear, and premature judgment. Cell phone cameras emerged from purses and jacket pockets, ready to capture whatever drama was about to unfold. Zoe began to cry, not the loud wails of a tantrum, but the quiet, heartbroken tears of a child who didn't understand why the world had suddenly become so frightening. "Daddy, what did we do wrong?" she whispered. Marcus felt his heart shatter. This was exactly what Angela had feared. Exactly what she'd made him promise to protect their daughter from. But here they were being treated like criminals in front of dozens of strangers, their dignity stripped away by someone's prejudice and lies. The lead police officer, a tall, stern-faced man with sergeant's stripes, approached their row. "Sir, I'm Sergeant Davies with the Metropolitan Police. I need you to come with me for questioning." Marcus looked up at the officer, his voice steady despite the rage building inside him. "Of course, Sergeant. But before we do anything else, I need you to understand that my 8-year-old daughter is terrified, and this entire situation has been based on false accusations from your flight attendant." "Sir, we're just responding to a report of a disturbance." "There has been no disturbance," Marcus interrupted quietly. "There has been systematic harassment of my family by this employee, and I have witnesses who can confirm that fact." Eleanor Thompson stood up from her seat in 2C, her voice carrying the authority of decades in federal court. "Officer, I am a retired federal judge, and I have witnessed this entire flight. This gentleman and his daughter have done nothing wrong. Every incident has been initiated by the flight attendant, who has repeatedly lied about this family." "Ma'am, please remain seated," Sergeant Davies replied, though his tone was less certain than before. "I will not remain seated while I watch an innocent man and child be humiliated based on false accusations," Eleanor replied firmly. "That flight attendant has been harassing them since takeoff, and now she's apparently filed false police reports to cover her own misconduct." Other passengers began to speak up. The businessman from 2A raised his voice. "She's right. I've been watching this the whole flight. The attendant has been completely inappropriate." The elderly couple from 3B nodded vigorously. "We never had any allergic reaction. She made that up completely." Sergeant Davies looked increasingly uncomfortable as he realized that the dangerous passenger report was being contradicted by multiple witnesses. But protocol was protocol, and he had a job to do. "Sir, I still need you to come with me for questioning. You can bring your daughter, but we need to sort this out off the aircraft." Marcus stood slowly, his imposing height causing Sergeant Davies to take an involuntary step back. But instead of the aggressive posture Rachel had described, Marcus displayed nothing but calm dignity and protective concern for his child. "I understand you have a job to do, Sergeant, but I want you to know that before this is over, you're going to discover that you've been given completely false information. And I want you to think about what that means for a little girl who's just trying to travel with her father." As Marcus gathered their belongings, Zoe clung to his side, her small voice barely audible. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" "No, sweetheart. We're not in trouble. Some people made mistakes, and now we have to help them understand what really happened." The walk through the aircraft was the longest journey of Marcus's life. Every step took them past rows of staring passengers, past whispered conversations and camera phones, past the judgment and assumptions of strangers who knew nothing about their lives or their loss. But Marcus held his head high, his focus entirely on the small hand in his and the promise he'd made to Angela. No matter what happened next, no matter how this situation escalated, he would not let his daughter's spirit be broken by someone else's hatred. As they stepped off the aircraft and onto the jet bridge, Marcus saw the welcoming committee that awaited them. More police officers, airport security personnel, and in the center of it all, Rachel Mitchell, wearing the satisfied expression of someone who believed she'd finally won. She had no idea that she was about to meet the most powerful enemy she'd ever made. Standing beside the police officers was David Harrison, SkyLine's London station manager, his face pale with anxiety as he tried to understand why his airline's most important potential investor was being escorted off an aircraft by law enforcement. "Officers," Rachel said, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "thank you for responding so quickly. He became very volatile during the flight, and I was genuinely concerned for the safety of our crew and other passengers." Marcus stopped walking. He looked at Rachel Mitchell for a long moment, seeing not just her individual hatred, but the system that had nurtured and protected it. Then he looked at David Harrison, seeing the dawning recognition in the station manager's eyes. The time for quiet dignity had passed. The time for strategic patience was over. The time for revelation had arrived. Marcus Washington reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his wallet. Not for his identification, not for his passport, but for something that would change everything. He extracted a simple business card, thick, expensive cardstock with elegant lettering. He held it out to David Harrison, the station manager who was standing beside the police officers with growing anxiety etched across his face. "Mr. Harrison," Marcus said, his voice quiet but commanding, "I believe we were supposed to meet tomorrow morning." Harrison took the card with trembling fingers. His eyes scanned the text, reading the name first, then the title beneath it. As comprehension dawned, the color drained completely from his face. The card read, "Marcus Washington, Chief Executive Officer, Apex Global Enterprises." Below that, in smaller text, "Private Equity and Corporate Acquisitions." Harrison stared at the card, then at Marcus, then back at the card. His mouth opened and closed silently, as his mind struggled to process the catastrophic implications of what was happening. Sergeant Davies, growing impatient with the delay, stepped forward. "Sir, we need to move." "Wait." Harrison whispered, his voice barely audible. Then louder, with panic creeping into his tone. "Wait, please." "Officer, there's been a terrible mistake." Rachel, still basking in her perceived victory, frowned at the station manager's reaction. "David, what's wrong? What does the card say?" Marcus looked past the confused police officers, past the trembling station manager, and met Rachel's gaze directly. When he spoke, his voice was calm, clear, and devastating. "It says that I'm the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Global Enterprises." He began, letting each word land with precision. "The private equity firm that your airline has been negotiating with for 6 months." He paused, watching Rachel's expression begin to change from triumph to confusion. It says that tomorrow morning I was scheduled to sign the papers that would make me the new owner of SkyLine Airways. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient noise of the airport seemed muted as the full weight of Marcus's revelation settled over everyone present. Rachel's face went through a remarkable transformation. The smugness melted away, first replaced by confusion. Then came the dawning realization, followed by a wave of absolute horror as she understood the magnitude of her mistake. She stammered, "That's not possible. You can't be a passenger in first class." Marcus finished for her. "A black man who doesn't belong in your cabin. Someone you felt comfortable lying about to police officers." Sergeant Davies looked between Marcus and the station manager, his police instincts telling him that the situation had just shifted dramatically. "Mr. Harrison, can you confirm this gentleman's identity?" Harrison nodded frantically, his hands shaking as he held the business card. Yes, this is Marcus Washington. Oh God, he's supposed to acquire our airline tomorrow. He's been flying incognito to evaluate our service. And he just experienced your service firsthand," Eleanor Thompson added dryly from behind them. She'd followed the group off the aircraft, determined to see justice done. Rachel's world was collapsing around her. The passenger she'd harassed, humiliated, and falsely accused wasn't just any customer. He was the man who held her airline's future in his hands. More than that, he was someone with the power to end not just her career, but potentially the careers of everyone who had enabled her behavior. "Mr. Washington," she began, her voice now pleading, "I had no idea who you were. If you had known, you would have treated me differently." Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp with controlled anger. "The problem, Rachel, isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you thought it mattered." He knelt down beside Zoe, who was still clinging to his side with tears streaming down her face. "The problem is that you saw a little girl who dreams of being an astronaut, and you decided she didn't belong in the same cabin as other children." Standing back up, Marcus continued, his voice rising with each word. "The problem is that you've probably done this before, to passengers who didn't have the power to fight back, to families who couldn't defend themselves against your prejudice." David Harrison was frantically making phone calls, trying to reach senior executives, trying to initiate damage control for what was rapidly becoming a corporate nightmare. In the background, Marcus could hear him speaking in urgent, panicked tones. "Yes, sir. We have a situation." "No, sir. It's much worse than that." Sergeant Davies, finally understanding that he'd been fed false information, turned to Rachel with barely concealed anger. "Ma'am, are you telling me that you filed a false report about this passenger?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "I was concerned about safety." "You were concerned about control," Marcus corrected. "You saw someone you didn't think belonged in your space, and you decided to put them in their place. The safety concerns, the medical emergencies, the seat mix-ups. All of it was fabricated to justify harassment." Eleanor Thompson stepped forward, pulling out her phone. "Officer, I recorded several of the incidents on this flight. I'd be happy to provide evidence of what actually happened versus what this employee reported." "Ma'am, if you could please." "Mrs. Thompson," Marcus interrupted gently, "that won't be necessary. This situation is going to be resolved through proper channels." He turned to Sergeant Davies, his voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Sergeant, I appreciate your response to what you believed was a legitimate security concern. However, I want you to understand what actually happened here." Marcus began laying out the facts with the precision of a CEO presenting to a board of directors. Each incident Rachel had initiated, each lie she had told, each escalation she had manufactured, all of it delivered with calm, devastating accuracy. My daughter asked for astronaut food, and she was told we don't serve that kind to those people. When my daughter needed to use the bathroom, she was directed to coach class and told the first-class lavatory was broken, while other passengers continued to use it freely. When we ordered dinner, we were questioned about whether my daughter could handle sophisticated food. Zoe, still clinging to her father, looked up at the police officers with wide eyes. "I can handle fancy food," she said in a small voice. "I eat at nice restaurants all the time." The simple innocence of her statement was more damning than any accusation Marcus could have made. The pattern continued for hours. Marcus went on. False claims about medical emergencies, fabricated stories about double-booked seats, and finally a completely fictitious report to law enforcement designed to humiliate my family and justify 6 hours of systematic harassment. Rachel Mitchell had become very small. Gone was the authoritative purser who had controlled the first-class cabin. In her place stood a middle-aged woman whose prejudices had finally met their match, whose comfortable world of unchallenged bias had crumbled in the span of a few revelations. "Mr. Washington," she whispered, "please, I have a daughter too. I need this job." "I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean to get caught," Marcus replied coldly. "You didn't mean to target someone who could fight back. But you absolutely meant to make my daughter feel unwelcome on this aircraft." David Harrison ended his phone call and approached the group, his face ashen. "Mr. Washington, I've spoken with our CEO. He's requested that I extend the airline's most sincere apologies and assure you that this matter will be investigated immediately." Investigated. Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Mr. Harrison, there's nothing to investigate. Multiple passengers witnessed everything. Your employee filed false police reports. The facts are not in dispute." He looked at Rachel one final time, his expression not cruel, but absolutely final. "Ms. Mitchell, you are terminated effective immediately. Your employment with any Apex Global subsidiary is permanently barred. Security will escort you from the premises, and you will surrender all company property before leaving." The words hit Rachel like physical blows. 20 years of employment, her pension, her benefits, her entire career. All of it destroyed in a matter of minutes. But Marcus wasn't finished. Furthermore, he continued, "I will be filing a civil lawsuit against you personally for defamation, filing false police reports, and the intentional infliction of emotional distress on a minor. The damages from that lawsuit will be used to establish a foundation in my daughter's name to combat discrimination in the travel industry." Rachel collapsed into a nearby chair, the full weight of her actions finally crushing her. She had started the flight, believing she was in control, believing she could humiliate and intimidate passengers she deemed unworthy. She was ending it unemployed, facing lawsuits, and about to become the poster child for corporate racism. Sergeant Davies, having witnessed the complete dismantling of the case against Marcus, made a decision. "Mr. Washington, I owe you and your daughter an apology. We responded to what we believed was a credible threat, but it's clear we were given false information. Sergeant, you did your job based on the information you received, but I hope this experience will encourage more thorough verification before taking action against passengers in the future." As airport security arrived to escort Rachel from the premises, Marcus knelt down beside Zoe one more time. "It's over now, baby girl," he said softly. "The scary part is done." "Daddy, are you really going to buy the airplane company?" Marcus smiled, thinking about Angela's words about teaching their daughter that she belonged anywhere. "Yes, sweetheart. And when I do, we're going to make sure no other little girl ever gets treated the way you were treated today." As they walked toward the VIP lounge, where the real business would be conducted, Eleanor Thompson caught up with them. "Mr. Washington," she said, "I want you to know that what I witnessed today reminded me why I spent 40 years fighting discrimination in federal court. Your daughter is lucky to have a father who stands up for what's right." Marcus shook her hand gratefully. "Thank you for speaking up, Your Honor. It means more than you know to have allies." As they disappeared into the terminal, Rachel Mitchell sat alone on the jet bridge, surrounded by the debris of her destroyed career, finally understanding that actions have consequences. She just never imagined they could be this devastating. 6 months after Flight 447 landed at Heathrow, the consequences of Rachel Mitchell's actions were still rippling through the aviation industry like shock waves from an earthquake. The criminal trial had been swift and merciless. Rachel faced multiple charges, filing false police reports, making false statements to law enforcement, and criminal harassment. The evidence was overwhelming. Passenger testimony, recorded conversations, flight data, and her own documented lies created an airtight case against her. During her sentencing hearing, Rachel's lawyer attempted to paint her as a victim of corporate pressure and personal stress. The divorce, the financial difficulties, the work environment, all of it presented as mitigating factors that explained her behavior. Marcus Washington sat in the courtroom gallery next to Zoe, who had insisted on attending, despite her father's reservations. "I want to see what happens to people who are mean to little girls," she had said, with the kind of 8-year-old logic that was impossible to argue with. When the judge asked if Marcus wanted to make a victim impact statement, he stood and spoke for 5 minutes about the lasting trauma inflicted on his daughter, about the message such behavior sent to minority travelers, and about the systemic changes needed to prevent future incidents. "Your Honor," he concluded, "this isn't about revenge. It's about accountability." Rachel Mitchell did not act in a vacuum. She acted within a corporate culture that enabled and protected discriminatory behavior. The question isn't just what happens to her, but what changes we make to ensure this never happens again. Rachel was sentenced to 6 months in prison, 2 years of probation, and 200 hours of community service, specifically focused on diversity education. She was also ordered to pay $50,000 in damages to the Washington family. But the criminal case was just the beginning. The civil lawsuit had been even more devastating. Marcus's legal team, led by David Martinez, had uncovered a pattern of complaints against Rachel going back 15 years. 17 separate incidents involving minority passengers, 9 of which explicitly mentioned her discriminatory behavior. All of it documented, all of it buried by SkyLine management, who had chosen to transfer or silence complainants rather than address the underlying problem. She wasn't a rogue employee, Martinez explained to the jury during closing arguments. She was the inevitable result of a corporate culture that valued the comfort of complaining customers over the civil rights of paying passengers. The jury awarded Marcus and Zoe $2.3 million in damages, far more than they had requested. But true to his word, Marcus didn't keep the money. Instead, he used every penny to establish the Zoe Washington Foundation for Travel Equality. The foundation's mission was threefold: provide legal assistance to travelers facing discrimination, fund bias training programs for transportation employees, and create scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in aviation and hospitality. Within 6 months, the foundation had received over 300 complaints from travelers who had experienced similar treatment. Stories poured in from across the country. Black families questioned about their seat assignments. Muslim passengers subjected to additional security screening. Hispanic travelers asked for extra identification. What happened to us wasn't unique, Marcus explained to a congressional committee investigating discrimination in commercial aviation. It was just the first time it happened to someone with the resources and platform to fight back. The acquisition of SkyLine Airways had proceeded, but under dramatically different terms. Marcus used the leverage from the discrimination incident to demand sweeping changes as conditions of the deal. Every SkyLine employee, from pilots to gate agents to flight attendants, was required to complete 40 hours of bias training designed by leading civil rights organizations. The curriculum included detailed case studies, including the Flight 447 incident, to illustrate how unconscious bias could manifest in customer service situations. New reporting mechanisms were established, allowing passengers to file discrimination complaints directly with an independent ombudsman rather than through the airline's internal system. Every complaint was investigated by external reviewers and tracked in a public database. Most significantly, executive compensation was tied to diversity metrics. Senior leaders' bonuses depended not just on financial performance, but on measurable improvements in equal treatment across all passenger demographics. The changes weren't limited to SkyLine. Under pressure from congressional hearings and public scrutiny, the entire aviation industry began implementing similar reforms. The Department of Transportation issued new guidelines for addressing discrimination complaints, and the Federal Aviation Administration added civil rights training to mandatory crew certification requirements. Rachel Mitchell's personal aftermath was equally dramatic, though far less positive. Her 20-year career in aviation was over, not just at SkyLine, but anywhere in the industry. Word traveled fast in the small world of commercial aviation, and her name had become synonymous with discrimination and liability. The financial consequences were crushing. Legal fees had consumed her savings. The civil judgment had forced her to sell her house, and her pension had been forfeited due to the criminal conviction. She'd moved in with her sister in Ohio, taking a minimum wage job at a discount retailer just to pay basic expenses. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the social isolation. Friends had distanced themselves after the story went viral. Her daughter, now a freshman in college, had changed her last name and refused contact. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her, recognizing her as that racist flight attendant from the news coverage. During her court-mandated community service, Rachel worked at a diversity education center, speaking to groups about the consequences of prejudice. It was painful, humiliating work that forced her to confront the ugliness of her own behavior. "I told myself I wasn't racist," she said to one group of airline employees attending bias training. "I thought racism was burning crosses and using slurs. I didn't recognize that my assumptions, my judgments, my need to put people in their place. All of that was just racism wearing a professional uniform." The work was genuine penance, and slowly Rachel began to understand the depth of damage she had caused. Not just to Marcus and Zoe Washington, but to the countless other passengers she had treated poorly over the years, to the colleagues who had learned from her example, to an industry that had enabled her behavior for decades. Meanwhile, Marcus and Zoe had not only survived their ordeal, but thrived in its aftermath. The London trip had been salvaged after the airport incident. They'd spent a week exploring the city, visiting the Greenwich Observatory as planned, and creating the positive memories that Angela had wanted for their daughter. Zoe's fascination with space had only grown stronger. The incident had taught her about injustice and advocacy, but it had also shown her that problems could be solved and systems could be changed. At 8 years old, she was already talking about becoming not just an astronaut, but an astronaut who worked to make space exploration accessible to everyone. "Daddy," she had said during their visit to the Royal Observatory, "when I go to Mars, I'm going to make sure kids from all backgrounds can come with me." Marcus had smiled hearing Angela's voice in their daughter's words, seeing his wife's values taking root in the next generation. The transformation of SkyLine Airways became a business school case study in corporate culture change. Under Apex Global's ownership, the airline's customer satisfaction scores improved dramatically, particularly among minority passengers. Employee morale rose as workers felt proud to be part of an organization committed to equality rather than complicit in discrimination. Most importantly, Complaints of discriminatory treatment dropped by 89% in the first year after the acquisition. The few complaints that were filed were handled swiftly and transparently, with results published quarterly in the airline's diversity report. Other airlines, recognizing the competitive advantage of genuine inclusivity, began implementing similar programs. The industry that had once seen diversity training as a legal requirement began to understand it as a business imperative. Eleanor Thompson, the retired federal judge who had spoken up on Flight 447, became an unofficial advisor to the Zoe Washington Foundation. Her decision to intervene to risk comfort and safety to stand up for strangers had helped ensure that justice was served. "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity," she said during a speech at the Foundation's first annual gala. What happened on that flight wasn't just about one family's trauma. It was about all of our responsibility to create the kind of world we want to live in. As the one-year anniversary of Flight 447 approached, Marcus reflected on how a moment of hatred had catalyzed so much positive change. Rachel Mitchell's prejudice had exposed systematic problems that might otherwise have remained hidden. Her actions had forced an entire industry to confront uncomfortable truths about bias and discrimination. In trying to humiliate and diminish an 8-year-old girl, Rachel had inadvertently created a foundation that would help thousands of children. In attempting to put a black family in their place, she had helped build a more equitable place for everyone. The karma wasn't just that Rachel had lost her job and faced consequences for her actions. The deeper karma was that her hatred had ultimately produced more love. Her exclusion had created more inclusion, and her attempt to make the world smaller had actually made it bigger and more welcoming for everyone. Exactly 1 year after Flight 447's tumultuous journey, Marcus and Zoe Washington found themselves walking through the same terminal at JFK Airport, preparing to board another SkyLine Airways flight to London. But everything was different now. As they approached the gate, Marcus noticed the changes immediately. The SkyLine staff was notably more diverse. The gate agents, the ground crew, the flight attendants visible through the jet bridge windows represented a rainbow of backgrounds and ethnicities that reflected the passengers they served. "Mr. Washington, welcome back," the gate agent. A young black woman with a bright smile greeted them personally. "I'm Jennifer, and I just wanted to say how honored we are to have you flying with us again." Zoe, now 9, and even more confident than she'd been a year ago, beamed at the attention. She wore a new dress, this one decorated with the solar system, and carried a backpack shaped like the International Space Station. "Are you excited about your trip, Zoe?" Jennifer asked, crouching down to the little girl's eye level. "Very excited. We're going to see the new exhibit at the Science Museum about Mars exploration, and Daddy promised we could take a tour of Mission Control at the European Space Agency." As they boarded the aircraft, Marcus couldn't help but remember the tension and dread he'd felt exactly 1 year ago. Today, there was only anticipation and excitement. The first-class cabin of the new Boeing 787 was even more impressive than the previous aircraft. But it was the crew that truly showcased the transformation. Captain Martinez, a Hispanic woman in her 40s, personally greeted VIP passengers. The chief flight attendant was a young man from Nigeria who spoke with passengers in multiple languages, ensuring everyone felt welcome. But the most significant change was in the culture itself. Marcus watched as crew members interacted with all passengers, regardless of race, age, or apparent economic status, with the same warmth and professionalism. As they settled into their seats, the same 1A and 1B they'd occupied a year ago, a familiar face appeared in the aisle. "Mr. Washington, I'm Maria Santos, the senior purser for today's flight." Marcus recognized her immediately. She was the young flight attendant who had taken over their service after Rachel's removal, the one who had shown Zoe kindness during the darkest moments of their journey. "Maria, how wonderful to see you again. "I've been hoping for this opportunity for months," she said, her eyes bright with emotion. "I wanted to thank you personally. Because of what happened on that flight, because of the changes you demanded, I was promoted to senior purser. More importantly, I now work for an airline where treating every passenger with dignity isn't just encouraged, it's required." Zoe looked up from her new space-themed coloring book. "You're the nice lady who gave me extra ice cream." Maria laughed, her eyes misting slightly. "And you're the brave little girl who inspired all of us to be better." During the meal service, Marcus marveled at the transformation. Every interaction was professional, warm, and inclusive. When Zoe asked about astronaut food, Maria didn't dismiss the request. Instead, she brought out a special freeze-dried ice cream that SkyLine now carried specifically for young space enthusiasts. "We partnered with NASA's educational program," Maria explained. "It was one of Mr. Washington's suggestions during the acquisition. The flight to London was everything the previous one should have been. Comfortable, respectful, and filled with the kind of service that made travel a pleasure rather than an ordeal." As they began their descent into Heathrow, Marcus reflected on the year that had passed. The Zoe Washington Foundation had already helped over 200 families who had faced travel discrimination. The bias training program developed after their incident was now being used by airlines worldwide. Most importantly, his daughter had learned that standing up to injustice, while difficult and sometimes painful, could create positive change that helped others. "Daddy," Zoe said, as London came into view below them. "Do you think that mean lady from last year learned her lesson?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. Through the Foundation's work, he'd actually heard about Rachel's community service and her efforts to make amends. It was genuine from what he could tell, though it could never undo the damage she'd caused. "I think she's trying to learn, sweetheart. Sometimes it takes people a long time to understand how their actions hurt others. But what's more important is that we helped make sure other families won't go through what we went through." "Good," Zoe said, with the satisfied finality that only a 9-year-old could muster. "Because space is for everyone, and airplanes should be too." As Flight 447's successor touched down smoothly at Heathrow, Marcus felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. They had returned to the scene of their trauma, not as victims, but as catalysts for change. The little girl who had been made to feel unwelcome was now the namesake of a foundation fighting for equality. The father who had been forced to defend his daughter's dignity had transformed an entire industry's approach to civil rights. The aircraft rolled to the gate, the main terminal this time, not a remote stand. No police cars waited on the tarmac. No false accusations hung in the air. Just a normal arrival for passengers who were treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. As they disembarked, Captain Martinez made a special announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to give a special welcome back to Mr. Marcus Washington and his daughter Zoe, whose courage and advocacy have helped make SkyLine Airways a better airline for all passengers. Thank you for flying with us, and welcome to London." The first-class cabin erupted in spontaneous applause. Other passengers, many of whom recognized the story, stood to show their appreciation. It was a moment of pure vindication, not just for Marcus and Zoe, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination and wondered if speaking up would make a difference. In the terminal, Eleanor Thompson was waiting for them. The retired federal judge had become not just an ally, but a family friend, and she'd flown to London specifically to meet them. "How was the flight?" she asked, embracing Zoe warmly. "Perfect," Zoe replied. "They had astronaut ice cream and everything. And more importantly," Marcus added, "they treated every passenger like they mattered." Eleanor smiled. "That's what progress looks like. Not just punishment for the people who do wrong, but systems that make it easier for people to do right." As they walked through Heathrow's bustling terminals, past families of every background and ethnicity, Traveling together without fear or harassment, Marcus felt Angela's presence strongly. She would have been proud of how they'd turned their pain into purpose, their trauma into transformation. The London trip that had begun with hatred and discrimination a year ago was beginning again with hope and inclusion. Sometimes Marcus reflected, the best revenge against bigotry isn't more hatred. It's building a world where love and equality triumph so completely that hatred becomes not just morally wrong, but practically impossible. Rachel Mitchell's attempt to humiliate a little girl had ultimately created a foundation that would help thousands of children. Her effort to exclude a family from first class had led to policies that made air travel more inclusive for everyone. And that Marcus thought as he watched his daughter excitedly planning their visit to the Greenwich Observatory was the most beautiful kind of karma possible. But this story isn't really about karma, is it? It's not about a racist flight attendant getting what she deserved, or even about a powerful CEO using his influence to right a wrong. This is a story about something much more profound, the difference between individual justice and systemic change. You see, Marcus Washington could have handled Rachel Mitchell's harassment in dozens of different ways. He could have demanded her immediate firing and walked away satisfied. He could have accepted a private apology and a voucher for future travel. He could have used his position to humiliate her publicly and moved on with his life. But he understood something that many people miss when they face discrimination. Individual bad actors are just symptoms of systemic problems. Rachel Mitchell wasn't born racist. She learned it. She practiced it. She refined it over 20 years of employment with an airline that repeatedly chose to protect her over the passengers she mistreated. She was the product of a corporate culture that valued the comfort of complaining customers over the civil rights of paying passengers. Firing Rachel, satisfying as it might have been, wouldn't have changed that culture. It wouldn't have helped the next black family, the next Muslim passenger, the next travelers who didn't fit someone's narrow definition of who belonged in first class. That's why Marcus did something that most people in his position wouldn't do. He used his moment of power, not just for personal vindication, but for institutional transformation. The bias training programs, the new complaint procedures, the diversity metrics tied to executive compensation. All of these changes were designed to address the root causes of discrimination, not just its most obvious symptoms. Think about this in the year following the Flight 447 incident. SkyLine Airways reported an 89% reduction in discrimination complaints. That's not just a statistic. That represents hundreds of families who didn't have to experience what Marcus and Zoe went through. Hundreds of children who boarded airplanes feeling welcome instead of unwanted. That's the power of thinking beyond individual grievances to systemic solutions. But there's another layer to this story that's even more important: the role of witnesses and allies. Eleanor Thompson didn't have to speak up. She could have sat quietly in her seat, watched the injustice unfold, and told herself it wasn't her business. Many passengers do exactly that. They witness discrimination, feel uncomfortable about it, but convince themselves that getting involved would only make things worse. Eleanor made a different choice. She recognized that remaining silent in the face of injustice is a form of complicity. She used her privilege as a white woman, her authority as a former federal judge, and her moral courage as a human being to stand up for strangers who were being mistreated. Her intervention didn't just provide crucial testimony for Marcus and Zoe's case. It demonstrated to other passengers that speaking up was both possible and necessary. It showed Rachel Mitchell that her behavior wasn't invisible or acceptable. Most importantly, it showed Zoe that when bad things happen, good people will fight for you. That's the lesson we need to take from this story. Injustice thrives in silence, and it withers under scrutiny. Every time someone witnesses discrimination and chooses to document it, report it, or simply speak up about it, they're participating in the same kind of systemic change that Marcus Washington initiated. They're sending a message that bigotry has consequences, that hatred will be challenged, that love and equality are worth fighting for. This story also illustrates something crucial about privilege and responsibility. Marcus Washington was fortunate. He had the resources, the platform, and the power to fight back against Rachel Mitchell's harassment. But with that privilege came responsibility. He could have used his power simply to punish the people who wronged him. Instead, he used it to build systems that would protect people who didn't have his advantages. The Zoe Washington Foundation doesn't just help wealthy families who can afford first-class tickets. It provides legal assistance and advocacy for travelers across all economic levels who face discrimination. That's what responsible use of privilege looks like, recognizing that your advantages create obligations, not just opportunities. Finally, this story is about the long arc of progress. Change is slow, difficult, and often invisible day by day. But over time, the accumulation of individual acts of courage, institutional reforms, and cultural shifts can transform entire systems. 50 years ago, Marcus and Zoe might not have been allowed in first class at all. 20 years ago, Rachel's behavior might have been dismissed as just how things are. Today, it resulted in criminal charges, civil penalties, and industry-wide reforms. That's not accident. That's the result of generations of people who refused to accept injustice as inevitable, who fought to expand the definition of who belongs in spaces of privilege and power. Rachel Mitchell thought she was putting a black family in their place. What she actually did was help accelerate their transformation into leaders of change. She thought she was defending the exclusivity of first class. What she actually did was help make air travel more inclusive for everyone. In the end, this story proves that hate contains the seeds of its own destruction. When prejudice reveals itself clearly enough, when its consequences become obvious enough, when its victims are powerful enough to fight back, it creates the very conditions necessary for progress. That's not karma, that's justice. And the difference between the two might just be everything. So here's my question for you. What would you have done if you had been sitting in seat 2A, 3B, or anywhere else on Flight 447, watching a flight attendant systematically harass a father and his 8-year-old daughter? What would your response have been? Would you have been like Eleanor Thompson, pulling out your phone to document what was happening, speaking up when the situation escalated, making yourself a witness for justice, even when it was uncomfortable? Or would you have been like most passengers, recognizing that something was wrong, but telling yourself it wasn't your business, feeling bad about what you were seeing, but convincing yourself that getting involved would only make things worse? There's no judgment here. Most of us want to believe we'd be heroes in moments like these, but the reality is that intervening in discrimination takes courage, preparation, and sometimes personal risk. The important thing is being honest about where we are now and committing to growth from there. But here's what I want you to understand. You don't have to be a retired federal judge or a billionaire CEO to make a difference when you witness injustice. You can document what you see. In an age where everyone carries a camera, evidence is power. Rachel Mitchell's lies would have been much harder to disprove without witness testimony and recorded evidence. You can speak up in the moment. Sometimes a simple, "That doesn't seem right," or "I saw what actually happened," can change the entire dynamic of a situation. Perpetrators of discrimination count on silence and isolation. Your voice can break both. You can report what you witness. Most companies, institutions, and organizations have formal complaint processes. Using them creates documentation, establishes patterns, and forces accountability. You can support the targets of discrimination. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply let someone know they're not alone, that their experience is valid, that someone else saw the truth of what happened, and you can work for systemic change. Vote for leaders who prioritize civil rights. Support organizations fighting discrimination. demand accountability from companies and institutions when they fail to address bias. The truth is, stories like Marcus and Zoe's happen every day in ways both large and small. The difference between these incidents leading to justice or being forgotten often comes down to whether good people choose to get involved. But this story also offers hope. It shows us that even the most entrenched systems can change when enough pressure is applied in the right ways. It demonstrates that individual acts of courage can ripple outward to create institutional transformation. It proves that love and justice, while they may take time, are ultimately more powerful than hate and prejudice. The Zoe Washington Foundation continues its work today, helping travelers who face discrimination and advocating for policies that make travel more equitable for everyone. SkyLine Airways has become a model for how companies can address bias proactively rather than reactively. And somewhere out there, a 9-year-old girl who was once made to feel unwelcome on an airplane is studying science and engineering, preparing for a future where she might actually make it to Mars. That's the real power of this story. Not that one bad person got punished, but that one incident of hatred was transformed into a movement for equality that continues to grow and spread. So I'll ask you again, what would you have done on Flight 447? And more importantly, what will you do the next time you witness injustice in your own life? Because there will be a next time. There always is. The question is whether you'll be ready to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it would be easier to look the other way. The choice, as always, is yours. But remember, silence in the face of injustice isn't neutrality. It's complicity. And in a world that desperately needs more justice, more equality, and more love, none of us can afford to be complicit anymore. The story of Flight 447 ended with transformation and hope. The story of what happens next is up to all of us to write.